The heavy smell of charred oak, melted butter, and aged grease hung low under the dim amber lights of the foundry, refusing to clear despite the expensive ventilation system humming somewhere in the high ceilings. Outside, the freezing December wind off Lake Michigan howled through the concrete canyons of downtown Chicago, driving sheets of hard gray sleet against the thick plate glass windows that overlooked Dearborn Street. Inside, the soft, monotonous hum of an old commercial refrigerator in the back mixed with the low, rhythmic, almost hypnotic clinking of silver cutlery against heavy porcelain plates. It was the kind of expensive, old-world steakhouse where men with polished Italian leather shoes paid $200 for a single ribeye without ever looking at the face of the person serving them. Marcus Vance was 16 years old when he stood near the heavy kitchen swinging doors, his fingers tightening around a damp linen cloth until his knuckles turned a dull white. His black uniform trousers were stiff from cheap dollar store detergent, and his lower back already ached with a dull, throbbing pressure from 5 continuous hours of clearing heavy oak trays. This job at the foundry was not an after-school hobby or a way to save for a car. It was the thin, frayed wire keeping his small apartment in the South Side warm during the brutal Midwestern winter. He kept his chin tucked firmly down, his eyes fixed on the cracked linoleum floor near the kitchen entrance, moving quietly between the shadows of the dining room. He had learned very early in his time here that in a place built on old money, a busboy was not supposed to be a person. He was supposed to be invisible. But nobody in that suffocating room understood what was actually written on that faded piece of paper tucked inside Marcus's apron pocket yet. At table 9, located in the far back corner where the shadows fell deepest and the candlelight flickered against dark mahogany wood, sat a very large man wearing a plain, unbranded, dark gray hooded sweatshirt. He had his hood pulled up slightly, just enough to cast a deep shadow over a face that had been printed on giant billboards across every major city on the planet. LeBron James sat quietly with 2 childhood friends from Akron, his massive 6'9" frame hunched forward over a simple glass of iced water to make himself appear as small and unremarkable as possible in the crowded room. He had just spent 4 exhausting hours at a newly opened community center 3 blocks away, personally handing out winter coats to families, and checking on a digital library his foundation had completely funded. He had intentionally sent his usual security detail to wait in the SUVs around the corner, because he wanted a single hour of ordinary silence, a moment to just be a father, a friend, and a man, before the team bus left for O'Hare Airport. 3 tables away, at the highly visible center booth labeled Table 6, a group of 5 corporate analysts from a high-profile venture capital firm on Michigan Avenue were celebrating a major quarterly acquisition. They had already emptied 3 bottles of expensive Napa Cabernet, and their laughter was loud, sharp, and cutting through the soft jazz music drifting from the ceiling speakers like a blade. The leader of the group was a man named Craig Sterling, a senior partner with a perfectly tailored wool suit, a heavy platinum watch that caught the amber light every time he moved his arm, and a face flushed a dangerous shade of dark red from alcohol. Craig liked order, but more than order, he liked the feeling of knowing exactly how much everything and everyone in a room cost. He had been watching the giant man in the gray hoodie for 20 minutes, his eyes narrowing with a strange, defensive kind of arrogance that usually comes from deep personal insecurity. Craig leaned over, nudging his younger associate with a heavy elbow while gesturing toward the dark corner table with his silver steak knife, his movements loose and aggressive. He did not whisper. His voice carried across the quiet dining room, heavy with the careless confidence of a man who had never had to clean his own messes or apologize for his words. Every other waiter in the room immediately looked away, their eyes suddenly finding intense interest in empty wine bottles, clean napkins, or the computer screens at the central ordering station. The floor manager, a nervous, balding man named Mr. Higgins, quietly stepped backward into the kitchen hallway, letting the heavy swinging doors close softly behind him to protect his own position. Craig stood up from his leather booth, his heavy chair scraping loudly against the polished hardwood floor as he reached into the breadbasket and picked up a hard sourdough roll. He threw it carelessly across the room, watching it fly through the dim light, bounce off the edge of LeBron's water glass, and roll into a puddle of condensation on the dark wood. The entire restaurant went dead silent, the sudden absence of sound pressing against Marcus's ears like a heavy weight as every fork froze midair. LeBron did not look up from his plate, his jaw tightening into a hard, rigid line, as he picked up the dry piece of bread with two massive fingers and set it on the side of his plate with slow, deliberate restraint. Craig laughed, a loud, dry sound that had no joy in it, and reached into the basket for a second roll while his associates exchanged uncomfortable, nervous glances. He called out across the quiet room, telling the greatest basketball player on earth to stand up and show the room why he was worth $90 million a year. He told him to dance for the table, to perform on command, because that was what people like him were paid to do. The words hung in the warm, expensive air of the restaurant like a foul odor, sharp and heavy, with an old, ugly cruelty. Marcus felt a familiar, burning heat rise into his throat, the exact same feeling he had when he watched his mother cut cardboard to line her worn-out winter boots. He thought about his father, a mechanic who had died on a freezing Tuesday afternoon when Marcus was 8, a man who had always told him that a person's dignity is the only thing nobody can take without permission. Before his brain could calculate the cost of his rent or the price of his mother's medicine, Marcus walked out of the shadows. He moved past the frozen waiters, past the empty tables, and stood directly between Craig Sterling and the giant man in the gray hoodie. He looked up at the tall executive, his hands shaking behind his back where nobody could see them, his voice small but perfectly clear in the dead silence. He asked the man to please stop throwing things, because everyone in this room had a right to eat their dinner in peace. Craig Sterling stared down at the 16-year-old boy like he was looking at an oil stain on a white carpet, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of crimson. He did not say a word. He simply picked up his half-full glass of red wine and flung it directly into Marcus's chest. The dark liquid soaked instantly through the thin white cotton shirt, spreading across his ribs like an open wound, cold and sharp-smelling. Marcus stumbled backward, his hip catching the edge of a serving tray, sending a stack of side plates shattering onto the hard tile floor. The sound of breaking porcelain cracked through the restaurant like a gunshot, scattering white shards the polished like brocal teeth. Mr. Higgins materialized from the kitchen doorway within seconds, his bald head glistening under the yellow lights as he grabbed Marcus roughly by the shoulder. He did not look at Craig Sterling, and he did not ask if Marcus was bleeding from the broken glass near his worn-out sneakers. He leaned close, his breath hot against Marcus's ear, telling him to pack his things and get out of his restaurant, because his time here was finished. From the corner table, LeBron James stood up, his massive shadow instantly covering both the manager and the red-faced executive. He took a single step forward, his voice deep and steady as he told Higgins to wait, explaining that the young man was only trying to protect his peace. But Mr. Higgins gave the international superstar a stiff, corporate smile, stating that staff discipline was a private matter for the establishment. He pointed one thick, shaking finger toward the back exit, his voice flat and final. Marcus did not cry. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting LeBron's for one brief, silent second across the ruined dining room. He walked into the back room, took off his stained apron, and placed it neatly on the steel counter. He walked out into the freezing Chicago night, his wet shirt freezing against his skin, completely unaware that a couple at table 4 had been recording every single detail on their phone. The freezing wind, screaming off the black waters of Lake Michigan, slammed into Marcus the moment the heavy glass exit door of the foundry clicked shut behind him. The air was a brutal, bone-chilling vacuum that immediately found the raw vulnerabilities in his thin denim jacket, piercing through the fabric like 100 tiny needles. Worse than the wind was the wet, expanding weight against his ribs, where the expensive Napa Cabernet had already begun to stiffen into a cold, rigid plate of frozen cotton. The dark crimson stain clung to his skin, smelling sharply of sour fermentation and ruined pride, a physical map of his sudden exile from the only place that kept his family afloat. He pulled his collar up around his neck, tucked his chin into his chest, and forced his feet to move down the snow-covered pavement of Dearborn Street. The city around him was alive with the glittering, careless energy of a mid-December Friday night in downtown Chicago. High-end department stores along the Miracle Mile blinked with millions of warm, festive lights, and shoppers wrapped in thick shearling coats laughed as they drifted toward waiting town cars. Marcus walked past them like a ghost, his worn-out canvas sneakers sliding precariously over the fresh patches of gray slush accumulating on the sidewalk. He kept his eyes locked on the ground, terrified that if he looked up, someone would notice the giant dark smear across his chest and see the raw humiliation still burning in his eyes. He felt entirely exposed, a 16-year-old boy cast out into the wilderness of a city that only cared about people who could afford the $200 price of entry. He walked 4 grueling windswept blocks until he reached the CTA bus shelter on State Street, a rusted iron structure that offered almost no protection from the swirling sleet. Under the harsh, flickering buzz of the yellow fluorescent overhead bulb, a small group of teenagers was huddled together, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of a smartphone. They were laughing loudly at a viral video, their warm breath rising into the freezing air in brief, cheerful clouds that vanished into the night. Marcus instinctively stepped backward into the deepest shadow of the shelter, crossing his arms tightly over his chest to conceal the wine-stained proof of his termination. Their laughter felt distant, belonging to a completely different universe where choices did not carry catastrophic consequences and a single mistake could not freeze an entire household. The heavy, metallic roar of the number 29 bus finally cut through the howling wind, its massive tires spraying a dirty wall of gray slush against the curb as it ground to a halt. Marcus stepped into the vehicle, the sudden, artificial warmth of the interior rushing over his face like a physical blow, but doing nothing to melt the ice in his stomach. He didn't look at the driver. He simply tapped his worn transit card against the electronic reader and began the long, heavy walk toward the very back row of seats. The bus was mostly empty, populated only by tired shift workers, their heads nodding against the cold window panes as the engine vibrated violently beneath the floorboards. Marcus slid into a corner seat by the emergency exit, pressing his forehead against the frosted glass as the bus pulled away from the glittering skyscrapers of the Loop. 2 rows ahead of him, an elderly woman in a faded wool coat turned around twice, her sharp eyes lingering on the dark, stiffened stain across his chest, with an unmistakable mixture of suspicion and pity. Marcus immediately shifted his posture, pulling the sides of his cheap jacket closer together until the zipper scraped against his collarbone. He did not want her pity, and he could not bear the thought of having to construct a polite lie to explain why a white uniform shirt was ruined with expensive alcohol. He wanted nothing more than to rewind the last 60 minutes of his life, to go back to the quiet safety of the kitchen shadows where he was invisible, compliant, and employed. But deep within his chest, Beneath the fear and the biting cold, a small, stubborn voice told him that if Craig Sterling raised that sourdough roll again, he would walk across that dining room exactly the same way. He reached his hand into the right pocket of his trousers, his fingers brushing against the coarse, fibrous texture of the linen napkin. He had swept off table 9 before grabbing his backpack. He pulled the crumpled fabric out into the dim, buzzing light of the bus, smoothing it flat against his thigh with the palm of his shaking hand. In the center of the linen, written in large, heavy blue ink strokes that spoke of immense haste, were 2 simple words: "I promise." Beneath the phrase was a 10-digit telephone number with an Ohio area code. The ink slightly blurred at the edges where the sweat from Marcus's palms had bled into the material. He stared at the handwriting for several miles, his thumb hovering over the numbers as the bus rattled over the potholes of the south side. The idea of actually dialing those digits felt absurd, an impossible fantasy hatched in the mind of a desperate kid who didn't understand how the real world operated. LeBron James was a global icon, a billionaire athlete whose life was insulated by layers of lawyers, public relations executives, and heavy security details. He was a man who moved through the world in private jets and bulletproof vehicles, far removed from the daily arithmetic of poverty that governed Marcus's existence. Why would a legendary figure remember a nameless busboy who had caused a scene and broken a stack of side plates on a restaurant floor? Doing the right thing was not a commercial transaction that guaranteed a payout, and Marcus knew that true dignity usually required a person to bear the cost of their convictions in total silence. He folded the linen napkin carefully, minimizing the creases before sliding it back into the deepest corner of his pocket, treating it less like a lifeline and more like a tombstone for his job. The bus finally groaned to a halt near 47th Street, the hydraulic doors opening with a loud hiss to let a blast of freezing Midwestern air invade the cabin. Marcus stepped down into 3 inches of unplowed, gray slush, the freezing water instantly penetrating the worn seams of his sneakers and numbing his toes within 3 paces. He walked the final 2 blocks toward his building, a weathered, industrial brick, 3-story apartment complex, where the outer door lock had been broken since October. The streetlights above him cast long, sickly orange shadows over the abandoned lots and boarded-up storefronts that defined his neighborhood, a stark contrast to the polished marble of Dearborn Street. He slipped into the dim, unheated concrete entrance hallway of the building, the air inside smelling faintly of damp insulation, old wood, and cabbage from a ground-floor apartment. He stopped near the long row of dented metal mailboxes, noticing that a large, unusually rigid brown paper envelope was sticking out of Box 3B. The small plastic window of the box still bore his father's name, Vance, written in fading black ink on a yellowed piece of Scotch tape that was peeling at the corners. Marcus pulled the heavy envelope out with a dull curiosity, tucking it carelessly under his arm alongside his textbook before looking at the front. He began the slow, exhausting climb up the concrete stairwell, each step feeling like an upward battle against a gravity that had grown twice as heavy over the course of the evening. The real terror was no longer the freezing wind or the loss of his dignity. It was the looming presence of the 3rd-floor landing and the conversation that waited behind the door of apartment 3B. The winter utility bill had arrived earlier that week, $48 higher than the previous month because the building's ancient central boiler forced them to run a cheap space heater to keep the bedrooms from freezing. His mother, Elena, had spent her only day off, sitting at the small kitchen table, methodically tracing the shape of her worn winter boot onto a thick piece of cardboard cut from a cereal box. She had slid the cardboard inside the sole to bridge a gap the size of a quarter, performing the task with a quiet, uncomplaining grace that broke Marcus's heart more than any insult Craig Sterling could throw. Now the small but vital stream of weekly wages he brought home from his 4 shifts at the foundry had been completely cut, severed by the arrogance of a man who would never know the cost of a gallon of milk. Marcus stood outside the chipped wooden door of apartment 3B for 10 long seconds, his key hovering just a millimeter away from the brass lock as he forced his breathing to slow down. He closed his eyes, allowing himself exactly 10 seconds to be a terrified child, to feel the crushing weight of the financial void that was about to swallow their little life. Then he squared his shoulders, lifted his chin to the angle his father used to keep, and turned the key, stepping into the small kitchen. The room was warm, filled with the comforting, familiar aroma of stewed tomatoes and lemon floor cleaner, but the atmosphere inside was entirely frozen. Elena Vance was sitting perfectly still at the small wooden table with the uneven leg, an untouched cup of chamomile tea sitting entirely cold in front of her. She was still dressed in her dark blue hospital scrubs from her grueling 12-hour shift. As a night nurse's assistant at the county facility, her shoulders curved with a deep, systemic exhaustion. She turned her head slowly at the sound of the deadbolt sliding back into place, her gentle, tired eyes instantly dropping to the massive, jagged map of dark red wine dried across her son's chest. Elena did not move for a long, agonizing moment, her rough fingers tightening around the ceramic handle of her cold mug as her eyes slowly scanned her son's face. She did not yell, she did not demand immediate explanations, and she did not let her voice rise into the quiet air of the small kitchen. Instead, she stood up with a slow, heavy sigh that seemed to carry the accumulated weight of her 20 years in this city, her movements deliberate and calm. She walked across the cracked linoleum floor, her hand reaching out to touch the stiff, dark fabric of his white uniform shirt, feeling the icy residue of the wine before looking deep into his eyes. Marcus felt his throat close up as he avoided her gaze, gently setting his old canvas backpack onto the counter alongside the thick brown envelope he had retrieved from the mailbox. He began to speak, his voice trembling slightly in the warm air of the room as he delivered the raw, unvarnished truth about the giant man in the corner and the executive at table 6. He explained how the entire dining room had gone silent, how the other waiters had turned their backs to protect their tips, and how Mr. Higgins had hidden behind the kitchen doors. He told her about the sourdough rolls bouncing off the wood, the ugly, loud laughter that filled the air, and the exact millisecond he decided he could not stay visible anymore. He did not try to make himself sound like a hero, nor did he exaggerate the cold cruelty of the man with the platinum watch. He simply described the broken porcelain scattered across the floorboards and the flat sound of the exit door closing behind his back. Elena listened to every word without a single interruption, her eyes moving from the dark stain on his chest to the rooster-shaped wall clock that Marcus's father had hung before his heart failed him. When the boy finished speaking, the small kitchen fell into a profound, suffocating silence, broken only by the rhythmic metallic banging of the old radiator pipes in the wall. Elena reached out, her calloused fingers wrapping tightly around her son's hands, squeezing them with a fierce, protective strength that instantly cut through his fear. She told him that his father, a man who had spent his entire life fixing broken engines in the freezing garages of the South Side, would have walked across that same floor. She whispered that a man's character is never measured by the thickness of his wallet, but by what he does when everyone else in the room is looking at their shoes. She stood up, gently pulling the ruined uniform shirt from his shoulders, and filled the porcelain kitchen sink with cold water and a heavy block of cheap yellow lye soap. Marcus watched his mother's back as she began to scrub the fabric with furious, methodical strokes, as if she could wash away the humiliation of the entire city with her bare hands. He walked into his tiny bedroom, plugged his cracked cell phone into the wall outlet, and sat heavily on the edge of his unmade mattress. The moment the device illuminated, a violent torrent of digital notifications began to cascade down the display screen like water breaking through a concrete dam. Instagram alerts, text messages from numbers he did not recognize, and 27 missed calls from his best friend Caleb flashed in rapid succession against the glass. One preview message from a classmate caught his eye before the display dimmed, telling him to check social media immediately because his name was tearing through the city. He rubbed his tired eyes, his thumbs hovering over the glass screen, with a sudden icy sensation of dread forming deep in his stomach as the phone vibrated against his palm. He opened the video application, typed his own name into the search bar, and the very first result made his breath freeze instantly in his lungs. It was a shaky, low-light video recorded from Table 4, capturing the exact geometry of the public confrontation at the foundry from 3 hours prior. You could see the red-faced executive throwing the bread, Marcus stepping into the amber light, and his small voice demanding respect for the man in the hoodie. You could hear the sharp crack of the porcelain plates shattering on the tile floor, and Mr. Higgins dragging him away by the arm toward the back exit. The video had been posted by a popular local food reviewer under a caption that read, "16-year-old busboy fired for defending LeBron James against corporate bullies at the foundry." Marcus stared at the numbers in the lower corner of the screen, watching the view count jump from 900,000 to over 1 million in the span of 30 seconds. The comment section was a roaring ocean of voices from strangers across the country, all demanding justice for a kid they had never seen before in their lives. People from Los Angeles, New York, and Cleveland were leaving thousands of messages, calling the manager a coward and praising the boy's parents for raising him right. But it was the top pinned comment, marked with a bright blue verification checkmark, that made Marcus's heart hammer violently against his ribs. The comment was from LeBron James's official account, stating that the young king had shown more courage than the entire restaurant combined, and asking the city of Chicago to help find him. Marcus dropped the phone onto his pillow, his eyes drifting up to the water stain on his ceiling, which had looked like a rabbit since he was a small child. The world outside his window was still dark, freezing, and completely indifferent, but inside his room, the ground beneath his feet had just shifted completely. Marcus sat on the edge of his bed for what felt like hours, the sharp blue light of his phone illuminating the small room as the view count on the video continued to climb toward 2 million. He could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of his mother's hands still working the soap into his uniform shirt in the kitchen sink, a steady and comforting sound against the digital chaos unfolding on his screen. His best friend Caleb had sent 14 more text messages, each one filled with capitalized words and exclamation points, demanding to know why Marcus was currently the #1 trending topic across the entire city of Chicago. Marcus did not reply to any of them. He simply set the device face down on his mattress and let the cold silence of the apartment wash over his mind. He stood up, his legs feeling strangely detached from his body as he walked back out into the small kitchen hallway where the air smelled of laundry soap. The brown envelope he had pulled from the mailbox still sat on the wooden counter, its thick, rigid paper reflecting the dull amber light from the old ceiling fixture. He picked it up with slow, hesitant fingers, turning it over to examine the return address printed in crisp, elegant black typography across the back of the packaging. The logo in the upper corner was a refined silver geometric emblem, followed by the words, "The Vanguard Academy of Media and Cinematic Arts, Los Angeles, California." Marcus felt his breath hitch in his throat as he stared at the name of the most prestigious, exclusive arts boarding school in the country. He slid his thumb under the thick paper seal, tearing the envelope open with a crisp, slicing sound that echoed loudly in the quiet kitchen. Inside was a heavy sheet of cream-colored parchment and a smaller official document stamped with a silver notary seal near the bottom margin. His mother stopped her scrubbing, her hands remaining submerged in the soapy water, as she turned her head slowly to watch her son's face change. Marcus began to read the first few lines silently, his eyes moving rapidly across the black ink as the air in the room suddenly felt incredibly light. The letter was addressed directly to him, stating that the admissions committee had completed their annual review of early portfolio submissions for the upcoming academic year. It explained that his high school art teacher, Ms. Olivia Sterling, who shared no relation to the man at table 9, had secretly submitted his entire sketchbook 2 months prior. She had collected the charcoal drawings Marcus had left behind on his desk. The letter details ordinary commuters on the 29 bus, and the portraits of his mother resting after her hospital shifts. The letter noted that the panel was profoundly moved by the raw emotional depth, the maturity of line, and the authentic human perspective captured within his work. They were offering him a full, unrestricted residency scholarship to their advanced visual storytelling and cinematography program in California, covering every dollar of tuition, housing, and materials. Marcus let his hands drop to his sides, the heavy parchment paper fluttering slightly as it rested against the wooden edge of the kitchen counter. He looked at his mother, whose face was already wet with tears she had been holding back since he first walked through the door with a stained shirt. She walked over to him, her wet hands leaving damp spots on his shoulders as she pulled him into a tight, desperate embrace that smelled of yellow lye soap and old winter coats. She whispered into his hair that his father had always known he would find a way to make the world look at the beauty he carried inside his mind. Before Marcus could process the reality of the letter, the phone on his bed began to ring, its sharp vibration rattling against the wooden frame of his nightstand. He walked back into the room, picked up the device, and stared at the 10-digit number with the Ohio area code that matched the ink on the linen napkin perfectly. He pressed the green button with a trembling thumb, lifting the receiver to his ear as a deep, warm, and unmistakable voice echoed through the speaker. The voice on the other end of the line did not belong to a character from a commercial or a loud press conference. It was a low, measured, and incredibly grounded voice that carried the natural cadence of someone who had spent his childhood navigating the same cold Midwestern streets as Marcus. LeBron James spoke slowly, introducing himself simply as LeBron, before thanking the 16-year-old boy for showing the entire city what real strength looked like. He explained that he had seen the viral video during his flight back to Cleveland, and that his team had spent the last 3 hours coordinating with local organizers to trace Marcus's contact information. LeBron told Marcus that, in his 20 years of public life, he had sat in hundreds of expensive dining rooms filled with corporate executives, politicians, and billionaires. He noted that when things became uncomfortable, those powerful men almost always looked down at their shoes, pretending that the injustice in front of them was not happening. He stated that it took immense courage for a teenager in a uniform shirt to step into the light and demand basic human respect for a stranger. The giant athlete paused for a brief moment, letting the weight of his words settle through the small speaker of the phone before continuing. He explained that he was the owner of a major media and film production company called Spring Hill, which focused on elevating the authentic stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things. He told Marcus that he wanted his experience at the Foundry to form the foundation of a new documentary series about the unseen human architecture of Chicago's working class. LeBron then offered him a fully compensated, year-round internship at the company's digital media division, structured entirely around his upcoming school schedule so he would never have to clear another man's plate to survive. Marcus sat in the quiet of his bedroom, his eyes fixed on the water-stained rabbit on his ceiling as he listened to the legend outline a future he had never even dared to imagine. He managed to whisper a small, broken phrase of gratitude before hanging up, his shoulders shaking as the first real tears of the night finally spilled over his lower eyelids. His mother came into the room, her rough arms wrapping around him as they sat together on the edge of the mattress, listening to the gray morning rain tap against the glass. By Monday morning, the systemic fallout from the viral video had completely dismantled the quiet, profitable reality of the foundry. The local media had picked up the footage, and hundreds of residents were gathering outside the restaurant's glass doors on Dearborn Street, holding signs that demanded the immediate termination of the management. When the corporate office of the restaurant issued a frantic public apology, stating that Mr. Higgins had been permanently removed from his position due to a catastrophic failure of basic human empathy and code of conduct. Meanwhile, the board of directors at the venture capital firm on Michigan Avenue held an emergency meeting to address the severe reputational damage caused by Craig Sterling's public behavior. By noon, a formal press release announced that Craig had been stripped of his partnership and quietly forced into early retirement, his name erased from the glass doors of the office he had spent 30 years building. Craig sat alone in his high-rise apartment overlooking the frozen lake, staring at his heavy platinum watch in the silence of his kitchen, finally realizing that the wealth he used as a shield had only revealed his own profound smallness to the world. 2 years later, the autumn sun cast a warm, golden light across the manicured lawns of the Visual Arts Academy in Los Angeles, California. Marcus Vance stood behind a heavy cinematic camera on a tripod, his fingers adjusting the focus ring on a lens as a group of first-year students moved across the courtyard behind him. His white uniform shirt was gone, replaced by a simple black cotton t-shirt, but tucked inside his canvas backpack was the old linen napkin with the blue ink that read, "I promise." He looked down at the small object, his thumb running over the smudged ink, remembering the cold smell of the red wine and the heavy silence of the restaurant floor. He knew that the world was still full of rooms where people looked at their shoes when things became difficult, but he also knew that he would never be invisible again.